All right, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dieter Lukas today, who's going to be giving the seminar, and he's based in Leipzig in Germany at the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology. My introductions are pretty casual, so all I really want to say is that I've spotted quite a number of Dieter's papers over the years and read them, and I'm very excited that he's coming to speak to us today. So some of his papers, just an arbitrary selection. He The first one I think I really noticed was one on social monogamy in mammals, which I guess you did, Dieter, while you were doing a postdoc with Tim Clattenbrock in Cambridge. That was a really nice paper. Then you had one on evolution of infanticide, which
Mhm.
was also really cool. And there's just so many different studies. So what I'd actually really say for Dieter is, rather than me droning on about him, I strongly encourage you to go and look at his website, because he has some really useful things there. For example, he has a fantastic catalog of resources for people looking for jobs. He has a links to vegan recipes for those of you who are feeling hungry.
Mhm.
Uh, and it also has an initiative, actually, along with a former member of our department, Alicia Carter, for increasing diversity in our field. And just as a little by the by, one of the things Dieter said when I invited him to give this talk is he asked me to check that we had diversity among our speakers. And I think anyone that's been watching our webinar series knows that we've made an active effort to ensure that we represent people from different parts of the world and from different backgrounds. And so Dieter already knew that in advance, but I like the fact that he reminded me of this. And it's important, I think, that we keep it going like that, and we ensure that everyone is included in what we do as much as possible. So that's another great aspect of the way Dieter approaches his science. Is he's very friendly and open and inclusive, and I really admire that, in addition to the fact he does great science. So I'm not going to say any more, Dieter. I'm just going to let you start your talk. And would you like me to keep my camera on so you can see a human being, or would you prefer if I turn it off?
The one is fine. Yeah, I'm probably so much in the zone I don't really notice
Okay,
necessarily.
I'll
So it's
turn
good.
it off in
Thanks.
case I forget to
Okay,
do something offensive.
right.
Thank you so much for doing this, and have a good talk, and we'll all be enjoying it from this side of the world and elsewhere.
Thank you. Yeah. When there was a very flattering introduction. So thank you for having me. I mean, it's great to be able to do this. I mean, there's lots of negative things, of course, with this current situation, but there is this aspect that we're more and more finding these ways to connect online that gives access and brings new bonds and opportunities. So I'm very excited to be here today and talk to you about environments, kinship, and the evolutions of social societies. So I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes, we can.
And great, thanks. And before I start, I want to acknowledge the people that helped me with this research. We all know I mean, it's really rare that we have this traditional idea that there's this researcher doing things by her himself. Now, of course, most of the things we do are collaborative, and here are some of the people that were particularly important for the research I'm going to talk about today. Tim Clattenbrock, Elise Houchard, Andreas Pondorfer, Thomas Basby, Jeremy Costa, Corinna Logan, Ariana Dalcero, and Pablo Enriquez. And so, yeah, this is a collaborative effort, but I'm going to mainly talk about from my perspective. So if there are any weird interpretations and any errors, they are, of course, then from me. But it's really a collaborative effort. And I think that is something that is really interesting about us humans, that we're always connected in these networks. And here's one of those examples. This is from a study that Ellie Power and colleagues did in a village in India. So each dot here is a single individual. The colors represent associations with different groups. And then the arrows connect interactions among these individuals. And that's really this network of interactions that we're all embedded in. Wherever we go, if we look at humans, we find these kinds of networks of interactions. And there are different structures to these networks and different kinds of interactions, how people help each other, how people might compete with each other. And what I'm interested in is trying to understand what shapes these networks, what shapes these societies, and what determines how individuals interact within them. And so we can already see some kind of structure here. And so the question is, why do we see these clusters? Why do we see interactions mainly happening within clusters? Can we try to understand where these patterns arise from? And the perspective I'm taking to trying to get some answers to these questions is a comparative perspective. So unlike these authors that really went into this village, studied all these individuals and their interactions in detail, I'm going beyond that. I'm trying to look across species. So I don't have the level of detail usually in my studies, but I can try to come at it from a different perspective. And for example, we can ask, okay, if we see these human societies, we always think we have really complex interactions. We have really complex societies. We interact with lots and lots of different people, but how much more complex and how different is it, for example, to a society of lions? So this is an abstract I made based on what we know about lions, but we also can show potentially different clusters of individuals, and we can show different interactions among these individuals. So can we potentially compare these societies, and in comparing them and trying to understand where these species live, what they do, how they reproduce, all the other aspects of them, can that potentially tell us why different kinds of societies develop? And to get at that and potentially be able to compare it, there's this helpful framework to actually start and break societies down. So if we want to understand these societies, I'm going to do that first now with the lions, and most of my talk is going to be focused on other mammalian species, so I'm going to be linking it back later to humans. So if we want to understand mammalian societies, we can actually start to understand and break them down in different parts. And partly this breakdown comes from how we can actually study these societies, right? If you imagine yourself going out on the African plains and just driving around in a Range Rover, the first thing you might see if you start to spot lions is they're usually clustered in groups. So if you come back the next day, you might find the same group in the same spot. You can maybe see that they are both males and females whenever you say these groups together. So the first thing we can usually describe about a society is the size, composition, and spatiotemporal coherence. So just where and how are individuals distributed across time? Just really the distribution in space and time. Then if you were to stay a bit longer, you might actually now be able to tell individuals apart. You can tell who is who. And if you can tell individuals apart, you can check the interactions among them. And so that's the social behavior. So we can describe, for example, that maybe in lions, what we see is that cooperation, helping acts mainly occur among the females within the same group. Aggression mainly occurs between groups. And mating is primarily restricted between males and females of the same group. So we can describe these pairwise interactions. And then if we stay longer, and if we repeatedly observe the same pairs of individuals and the same groups of individuals, we can actually see that these interactions lead to social structure. And that is, we can define that maybe there's one dominant male in each group. And he dominates the other males. He's the one who mostly gets all the matings in the group. And so we can actually see that there are different positions in this group. And we can't get that from a single interaction usually. We need these repeated interactions. And then from that comes the structure in the group that has different roles, where individuals have different roles. And those are usually the three parts that are helpful to use to actually start to break down groups, because they can help us to see where groups differ in different species or even within the same species. And it can help us to then potentially find factors that explain these differences. So we could potentially expect that different patterns shape social organization, so the spatiotemporal distribution, or some other factor might shape social behavior, and something else that might shape social structure. But we can also think that these factors are actually linked to itself, right? Who you are hanging out with probably depends on whether you can actually show some kinds of social behaviors or not. If you're solitary, we can already expect that you probably show different social behavior than if you were to live in a group. And then, of course, as I said before, these interactions might lead to the social structure. So there are probably already some links among them. And that's what people have been describing for a while already. And the traditional model that existed for mammals, and particularly for primates, was this assumption that there's really this strict linear relationship. So if we know something about the ecology where these species live, and people particularly focused on food distribution and predation risk, that will tell us something about the social organization. And people mainly focus on females, and I'm going to be mainly focusing on females during my talk as well, because in mammals, females are the ones that are probably more limited by resources in the environment. And then the type of social organization that directly results from the ecology shaped their competitive regime. And the idea was that influences the social relationships, the social structure. So this previous theory really just assumed a very straightforward, just if you know food distribution and predation risk, you can predict everything about these societies. And now we know, of course, it isn't as simple as this. And what I want to focus on during my talk today are two factors I think that are really important that might not have been considered as much. And these two factors are life history and kinship. I mean, of course, kinship, I think that's a factor people have talked a lot about. And I'm going to come back to these early important studies. And from what I've seen, this has been a theme already during some previous talks during this seminar series, the role of kinship in shaping social organization and social behavior. But I think there's something else to add from our understanding of mammalian societies that I want to show today. And then the other factor I really focus on is life history. And I think life history is something that we need to integrate more if we really want to understand the diversity of social systems that occur across species. So what do I mean by life history? So life history is the investment of individuals into reproduction. And people have been arguing based on empirical data that there's primarily two axes of variation in how females invest energy into reproduction. And the first axis is the one that is linked to whether it's a slow or fast life history. And so across species, usually there's always a relationship with body size. So that's shown on the x-axis. And there's a link with mortality. And with mortality, there's a link with how early you start to reproduce, how long you live, how long the intervals are between reproductive events. And so what we can see is that usually species with a large body size have low mortality, they live long lives, they have a slow life history. Species with small body sizes usually have higher mortality and usually have a fast life history. And so body size explains a lot of that variation, but of course there's additional variation among species where for a given body size, individuals might experience high or low mortality and accordingly might have different reproductive schedules. The second axis of variation is linked to then, if you now have the timing, how much do you invest at any given time? And again, there's a link with body size, where larger species invest usually relatively little of their total available energy at any given bout, even though the offspring itself might be bigger. Proportional to their body size, they usually invest less than species with small body sizes. And then again, even for a given body size, there can be variation that some species have low maternal investment, other species have high maternal investment. So this is variation in female life history in mammals. There's usually these two axes. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the second one, the maternal investment, because I think that really plays a role in explaining some of the differences we can observe in social system across mammals. And the variable I'm going to be focusing on for this is whether females produce single offspring or whether females produce litters of offspring. The reason why I'm going to be focusing on this is because it's a relatively easy thing to measure. Other things are much more difficult to measure in terms of reproductive investment. So we have data for a lot of species. It's actually really well studied, and we actually know that it potentially links to female investment, and there have been some ideas that this actually might be a trait that also might link to differences in sociality. And so just to show you how this actually links to investment, there's some study in rodents where people looked at females having given birth either to single offspring or multiple offspring. And then they physiologically measured the calories that females had to spend per day during pregnancy and then during lactation. What you can see, of course, it increases. If you have more offspring, you need more energy, but it doesn't increase linearly. It increases exponentially. So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 offspring, it's not twice as much energy if you have a single offspring. It's actually more than twice as much. And I guess people with multiple children might actually have some understanding of that it doesn't just increase linearly. It's actually, yeah, you have additional investments, takes you more time, takes you more energy. So there's really this additional cost in producing large number of offspring at a given time. And so this means that females who produce litters of offspring, multiple offspring at once, probably need more energy at that given time, the calories per day. So there might be more competition over food. The second thing that we can usually see that is linked to whether females produce single offspring or litters of offspring in mammals is that when females produce single offspring, these offspring can usually come along with the mother. So there are lots of primate species where females produce single offspring, and the offspring can be carried by the mother. Or there's some ungulates where the offspring is then well developed enough and they can just follow the mother along. Whereas in species where females produce litters of offspring, these offspring are usually parked in nests. They're small, they're relatively underdeveloped, so they can't yet follow the mother or cling to the fur. And so they're left in these burrows, they're left in nests in trees. And that also means that females have to actually come back to these nests. And that limits how far they can range. And that limits also competition, both then over the resources around that nest, and actually the nest itself is a resource, and there might be competition among female over access to these nests. So what we can expect is that in species where females produce multiple offspring, there's much higher competition, because females compete over the nests and females compete over resources, whereas the competition on any given day might be lower in species where females produce single offspring. And so does this actually play out? And so together with Elise Houchard, we looked at one of these measures of potential competition among females, and that's infanticide. So here it's a meerkat female that has just killed her granddaughter. So actually the children of another female, but of her daughter. So her granddaughter is the killed offspring here. And this killing of offspring of other females is much more likely in species where females produce litters of offspring than in species where females produce single offspring. So there seems to be this thing that really, when there is potentially more need for resources, higher competition, females are much more likely to kill each other's offspring to get more resources for their own offspring. And this level of competition then also seems to affect how social species can be. And so this is across all mammals, looking for species where females produce single offspring and females produce litters of offspring. What's the percentage of these species where females then live in groups? And we can see it's much more likely for mammals that individuals in species will form groups if the females in these species produce single offspring than if the females produce litters of offspring. And even if these groups form in species where females produce litters of offspring, these groups are usually much smaller than in the species where females produce single offspring. So groups can be much larger if females produce single offspring. So what we can really see here is that there's a link between life history, the level of competition, and then how that affects the social organization of species. And so we have the first link here, from life history to social organization. What we can see in mammals is that in species where there's extended reproductive investment, so where there are these long lifespans and females invest relatively little at any given time, there's the potential for association. Whereas when there's intensive reproductive investment, when females produce litters, there are high levels of competition. And that limits how many females can come together, and particularly how many breeding females can come together. So in species such as meerkats, where females do live in these groups, it's usually just one female who breeds. So it's not just the number of females, but it's also the number of the females in the group who actually breed. So we see this difference across species and how life history might shape their social organization. And there's an additional factor, and this is again then linking to kinship. And so life history not just influences whether females come together or not, but it also influences with whom females come together. So in species where females produce single offspring, like in these baboons, there's a limit in how many siblings a given female can have. If her mother produces few offspring and it takes long intervals between them, there's a maximum number of offspring she can produce. So for a baboon, it's probably a maximum of 8 to 10 offspring a female can produce across her lifetime. So that sets a maximum of the total number of siblings a female can have, and quite a few of them are going to die. Half of them are going to be probably sons. So the number of siblings that are available and then the number of siblings that are in the group, especially if the groups are large, is actually quite small. And that means most of the females she will interact with are unrelated to her. Whereas in the meerkats, I think the top female they know produced over 80 offspring. And all of them are going to be closely related now, and they all stay in the same group. And even though most of them die, all the ones that are survives are probably going to be sisters of these females that actually stay in the group. So what we have in this case, if females produce litters at short intervals, there's lots and lots of siblings available. And that means that individuals will mainly interact with relatives. And then we have some intermediate situations, such as in lions, where females produce litters, but multiple females give birth. So there are these matrilines, groups of related females that have both high relatedness and then some females that are not as closely related to. So it really looks like the number of siblings, which is determined as this female reproductive investment, will limit what percentage of group members are kin. And Mark Dibble and Tim Clutton-Brock actually looked at that, both with simulations and then with available data. And so here are the results for simulations. So they simulated different scenarios of species where females produce single offspring and of females produce litters of offspring. And then they asked, like, we can change group size, we can change reproductive skew, we can change the number of females in the group. In all these different scenarios, how likely is it that females in the group will on average be closely related to each other? And as closely related, they took levels of 0.25 or higher. So half siblings, grandparents, grandchildren levels of relatedness or higher. And that barely ever occurs in scenarios where females produce single offspring. But there's quite a reasonable chance that in species where females produce litters of offspring, everybody in the group will be closely related to everybody else. So we now have another link between life history and social organization, in this terms kinship, in what is actually the relatedness among individuals within the group. So if we bring those two things together, we can see that again in species where females have extended reproductive investment, it's quite likely that females will form groups. Groups can be quite large, but then most of the partners in the group will be unrelated to each other. Whereas in these cases where females have intensive reproductive investments, there will be small groups, but they will all be family members. So we get very different groups in mammals depending on life history. And so I think this goes beyond just ecology. We know that ecology influences life history. We know that external mortality, food availability, and these factors influence life history. So I think quite a few of the links that people previously described between ecology and social organization might actually be mediated by life history. I think ecology plays an additional role. I think higher predation risk still might be a factor that makes females more likely to come together in a group. But I think it's just that with high predation, if females have high competition, that might not be sufficient to overcome this infanticide risk and all the other things that exist when females produce litters. So we now have a link from life history to kinship and social organization. And so if kinship is now really an important factor that is shaped by life history and that explains differences in social organization, how does that link back to social behavior? And I think most people here know of all these studies of how kinship shapes social behavior. And I think you had some talks already in previous weeks of high levels of kinship really leading to specific kinds of groups. And we see again this variation in kinship in mammalian society. So it's just like as an illustration here again of something I said before. So we have with something like a meerkat where females produce litters, these small groups where everybody is related. We have in lions these groups where there's these clusters of related females. And then in baboons, we have these large groups where females are mostly unrelated to each other. So we can look across these different kinds of groups and we can expect that, yes, kinship might now influence how individuals treat each other in these groups. And most of the focus has been on these groups where everybody is closely related to each other. And there are lots and lots of studies that really have shown that in these species where we have intensive reproductive investment, high levels of kinship, they form these particularly kinds of societies, the cooperative and eusocial breeders. And it has been described for not just mammals, but I mean, as far as I know, across the whole kingdom of life, from microbes through everything else, that kinship plays a role in these cooperative societies, where we can really see that individuals show different kinds of behaviors than we observe in other kinds of species. And these kinds of behaviors we can observe, I would classify under them as structural complexity. What we usually have in these societies is that there are dominant individuals and helpers and subordinates. And the dominant individuals are the ones who reproduce, and the helpers provide support in raising the offspring of the dominants. And so we have these different castes, these different levels of societies. And so we have structure within the group. And we have these really high levels of alloparental care, helping others to raise their offspring. So really high levels of cooperation, even though there are really high levels of competition as well, where there's reproductive suppression, where dominants stop subordinates from reproduction. We usually don't see that on a day-to-day basis. It's usually then either physiologically, as in some of the insect species, or it's clearly through the rank in the group. So there's lots and lots of studies on these kinds of societies that really link it to high kinship. So what I want to focus on now is, okay, so what's the flip side? What I just said before in mammals is that in mammals, it's much more likely that groups will form when females produce single offspring. And when females produce single offspring, these groups will mainly consist of unrelated individuals. So what kind of groups form under these kinds of scenarios? And can our understanding of how kinship shapes behavior also tells us something about these societies? And it turns out that yes, it probably does. But sorry, I just forget. I wanted to say one more thing here about cooperative and eusocial breeders. The other thing that all these studies about cooperative and eusocial breeders tell us is that most of these links aren't unidirectional, right? When I first showed you this previous theory, it went from ecology to social organization, to social behavior, and to social structure. Lots of the studies we now have on cooperative and eusocial breeders show us that nothing in nature is just one directional. That we have links back, right? If you have helpers, that might influence on how many offspring you can have. If you have a certain social system, it might allow you to move into certain areas where other species couldn't survive. So we have links that go back and forth between all these different patterns. It's not just this one directional link where it goes all the way in one line. Actually, all these kinds of studies show us that we have to consider this as a co-evolution, where if you now develop a social organization that might influence your life history, that might reinforce what you're doing, that might allow you to move into a different ecology. So we need to think about it more dynamic. And I think this is really important as well to consider beyond the previous studies, that these studies, the new studies show us that yes, there's not just one linear line of causal interaction. So we have all these different relationships. Sorry, before I remember the slide, what I actually wanted to say is now, what is the role of then understanding kinship in telling us something about these societies where kinship is low? And that's what's shown here. So on the x-axis is the level of average relatedness between females in groups. So each dot here is a different mammalian species. And so here on this side, we have the rate of aggression we can observe in the group. So in species where average relatedness is high, on a given day, there isn't much aggression, which is again what we expect. Individuals are related to each other. They don't want to harm each other because of costs of inclusive fitness. Whereas if relatedness is low, there's high rates of aggression. Individuals constantly fight with each other over access to resources. And so there's this constant struggle in these groups. Large groups, unrelated individuals, they constantly have to fight over resources. And we don't see these high levels of alloparental care necessarily in these groups where everybody's unrelated. Instead, when individuals are unrelated, what we see is this reciprocal cooperation. So the reciprocity in grooming means if I groom you a lot, if I clean your fur a lot, you clean my fur a lot. So high values means here that everybody matches what their partner is doing, whereas low level means there's one individual who does a lot of the grooming and then the other one doesn't ever groom them back. And so again, with high kinship, you can expect that. You get inclusive fitness benefits. It might be mothers grooming their daughters, or it might be subordinates grooming the dominants. But we really see when individuals are unrelated, when they don't potentially get inclusive fitness benefits, then they really exchange these kinds of favors and these kinds of cooperative interactions between pairs of individuals. And so we see different kinds of societies here forming. We see constant aggression, we see high reciprocity, and we can actually see that this links to whether individuals form coalitions. So here the individuals can really partner up and actually together solve the aggression. And that means that individuals' position in the groups are also much more fluid. Individuals can actually change their rank depending on who they might be able to partner up with and build bonds with on a given day. And this really then means we have a very different kind of society. And so we don't have this structural complexity that we have in the cooperative breeders, where some individuals are high ranking, dominance, other individuals are low ranking. Here, we term this relationship complexity. You have to remember who your partner is. You have to remember who helped you yesterday, or you might not necessarily have to remember it, but you can just use other cues that are available to you. And then with these partners together, you can change your position in the group, and that can change on a day-to-day. So it's a very fluid group where it's complex, where you have to remember all your relationship with everybody else. You can't just say, this is the dominant, I treat her different from everybody else. But you have to remember, okay, does she still have her coalition partner? Can I potentially attack her now? Who is my coalition partner? So this is high relationship complexity. And this has been described for a range of species. It's been mainly studied in mammals, because I think in mammals we have these long-lived species where females produce single offspring. But there's quite a few studies now, for example, in birds as well, that describe similar patterns where individuals form strong bonds with particular partners that they use in coalitions to then increase their status within the larger group. So here we can really see that low kinship driven by female reproductive investment leads to also very specific kinds of societies. And I think people hadn't looked at that before from this slide, that we can use this, our understanding of kinship, to also explain these kinds of societies. And it tells us something about the social relationships that form in these kinds of species. And so again, then we have a link here from kinship to social organization and social behavior, that where we have high kinship, we have high relationship complexity. So these large groups of unrelated individuals are usually egalitarian with frequent conflict. Whereas in these species that are small, where individuals are mainly highly related to everybody else, they're hierarchical with this rare intense conflict. So for example, if the dominant dies, there is lots of fightings. Females will kill each other to get that dominant position. But once the dominance hierarchy is established, then on a day-to-day basis, usually fighting is rare. So we now have a link that actually links, again, life history, kinship to social behavior and social structure, and not just these cooperative eusocial species, but across the whole range of kinship in mammalian societies. So I think that's why it's really important to consider life history and kinship when we try to understand societies. Life history influences who the interaction partners are. It determines whether you have just random neighbors that you rarely interact with, or whether you form groups, and whether the individuals in the groups are your family members or not. And then that kinship influences how interaction partners are treated. Do you show constant aggression, or do you actually establish yourself in a clear dominance hierarchy in that group and then potentially help each other? And so we now, based on studies across other mammalian species, we have this kind of understanding of how to break down societies, and then some of the factors that might play a role in shaping the variation in the social organization, social behavior, and social structure of these societies. And so when I started, I said, like, look, these are the networks in humans, and we want to potentially compare them to the networks in other species and see whether human networks are more complex and whether we can understand how these human networks came about. So can we use this knowledge now about some of these factors that play a role in shaping societies to potentially also explain the formation of human societies and the interactions we observe within them? And that's some research I've recently started. So I'm now in a department of human behavior ecology and culture. So I'm trying to understand, can we explain some of the patterns we observe in humans with this knowledge from other species? So we have this framework now, right? We have this framework that links ecology to life history, social organization, kinship, social behavior, and social structure. Can we expect that some of the links we observe here also play a role in shaping human societies? And as a first step, I just wanted to know, okay, for this all to work, we can always trace it back to ecology. There's something about the environment that determines, for example, the risk of mortality, that explains predation risk, that explains how much food is in a given place, how predictable the food is, that links to life history and social organization, which then shapes everything that comes after. Are humans still influenced by ecology? I think that's the first thing we need to ask before we can look at the links within this framework. To answer this question, together with two economists, I just wanted to look at the variation in human behavior and whether it links to ecology in the same way as it does in other species. And the data we had available was data that was collected by anthropologists on, in this case, forager behavioral variation. So data set by Binford. There are 338 societies, so each dot here is a different human society, where based on ethnographic knowledge, people have been describing the behavior of these individuals in these different societies. Where do they live? How do they treat each other? What's the structure of the society? So we have relatively detailed knowledge of the ecology and social behavior of these societies. And we know where they live or lived. Some of this data are from past societies. And then what we did is match these societies to other species living in the same areas. So if we want to know if ecology influences human behavior in the same way as does other species, we want to know what do the other species that live in the same place do. So here's one example. So this is the Mbuti society that lives in the rainforest of the Congo. And we match within 25-kilometer radius which mammals and which birds also live in the same area. And so there's roughly 170 mammalian species that live in this area. It's a rainforest, so it's a high species diversity. And then for all these different species, we had some kind of idea of how they behave in that environment. And they wanted to know, do they behave the same way as the humans do? And we can do that for all these different societies. And so one variable, for example, we looked at that's directly linked to the environments is, do you store food or not? And the Mbuti only store small quantities of food. They live in the rainforest, which means there's usually food available year round, but it can perish really quickly. I mean, they don't have refrigerators, so you can't really store food that well because it will just go bad. So yeah, they just store small quantities of food. And if we then look at the mammals, only 4% of the local mammal species, 7 out of the 171 that live there, store food. So it's also quite rare for mammals that live in the same area to store food. Now we can do that across all these different locations for the humans and the mammals. And that's what's shown here. So on the x-axis is that how much food the given human society at the location stores. So each dot here is one of these locations on the Earth. And so humans can store minor quantities of food, moderate, major, massive quantities of food. And then in the same place, what's the percentage of mammals that store food? And so here in areas like where the Mbuti live, where humans store small amounts of food, usually only very few mammals store food. Whereas in areas where humans store large amounts of food, also a large percentage of the mammalian species store food. There seems to be something about the environment that determines the behavior of humans around food storage the same way as it determines the majority of other mammals that live in the same place. And so this is one behavior we looked at. We looked at a whole lot of the range of foraging behaviors. And for most of them, we find a similar link that the behavior of humans, mammals, and birds is very similar at a given location. So I showed you food storage. We found it for meat diets. So in areas where humans get more of their calories from hunting, there's a higher percentage of carnivorous mammals and birds. Same thing with fish diet. Day range, there's some places in the world where humans and mammals and birds range further every day to find food. There's some places where migration is more likely to occur. And there are some places where the densities, the number of individuals in a given place, is higher in all the different species that live in that place, including the human societies. And so this isn't the deterministic link necessarily. So it isn't that if you live in that place, this is how you have to behave. Right? What I showed you before on the slide as well is that it's not that all mammals in an area where humans store large amount of food store food. It's a high percentage, but it's not all. And we also have sometimes human societies that live next to each other that can behave very differently. I think it's probably better to think about it of constraints, right? If you think about a fish diet, you can't go fishing if there are no fish, right? If you live high up in the mountain where there are no rivers, you can't go fishing. But it doesn't mean that if you live down at the ocean, that if you have to go fishing. It's quite likely that you will, but it's not deterministic in the way that you now have to go fishing. There might be societies that live close to the ocean that still get most of their calories through other ways. But there are these constraints in the environment that limits in what you can do. And apparently these constraints operate very similar in humans and in other species. Not necessarily for all traits. We didn't find it for group size. And I think that might be a problem of how we actually, what is a group? How do we define a group, especially in humans where situations can be very fluid? And then there can also be, of course, as I showed you before, different kinds of group, cooperative groups versus these large groups. It's not that this is now a social behavior, right? I mean, these factors I showed you now here, they are directly linked to the environment. They are how you get your food from the local environment. Group size, of course, is more social behavior. But we did look at other social behaviors and we did find the link. So this is paternal care. So on the x-axis again is the human variation, the share of human children's diets provided by father. How much is very little or a lot of the calories that children get from the efforts of the father. Then on the axis here is the fractions of mammals with paternal care. On the axis here is the fractions of birds with male-only care. And we can again see these positive correlations. So each dot is a place on the world in areas where men in humans provide more food to their children. There's a higher percentage of mammals with paternal care and birds with male-only care. And we use birds with male-only care because in most bird species, we have this monogamous situations where both parents care, but there's a few species where it's just the males who care for the offspring, and they are much more likely to occur in areas where men care more for their children. And we can also see then, of course, the link between how the mammals behave and how the birds behave. It's all the different species are similarly influenced by the local environment. And we found that for lots of other social behaviors. We found it for polygyny. So there's some places in the world where men are more likely to have multiple wives, and it's more likely that mammals live in harems, and that birds will invest more into extra-pair matings. We have some areas where age of reproduction is earlier. Exogamy, how far do you have to move to find a mating partner, is higher in some areas in the world than in others. Divorce, so we had data for birds and for humans. So in areas where birds are more likely to divorce and find a new partner from one year to the next, divorce is much more likely to occur in the human societies that live in the same place. And then social classes, what I described before with the cooperative new social breeders, whether you have these cooperative societies, they're much more likely to occur in places where humans have clear social classes. We did not find a relationship for sex bias and dispersal, and it might be that this is potentially more explained by other social factors and potentially some of the local ecological conditions. But overall, for most of the factors we looked at, we did find that human behavior was influenced in the same way as the behavior of other mammals and birds. So there seems to be something about the environment. So we wanted to look at that in more detail. So all these different societies live in very different environments. So the Mbuti I showed you before live in the tropical rainforest. We have some societies like here on the coast of the US that live in these temperate conifer forests. In Australia, there's some societies that live in subtropical savanna. So the environments where these individuals and these different populations live can be very different. And so we wanted to know, okay, is it really the variation in behavior linked to these particular environments where these species live? So here's the example for food storage. So what I told you before, right? In the tropical rainforest, usually food storage is rare. In subtropical savanna, also food storage is actually quite rare. Whereas in the temperate conifer forest, yes, there is food storage. So these are the values again for the specific society that live in these specific places. So if we look at these 3 places in the world, in the Round Valley, 20% of mammals that live there store food. We can now do that for all the different societies that live in temperate conifer forest, tropical rainforest, and subtropical savanna, and see how consistent is it. Is it that in tropical rainforest, food storage is always low, subtropical savanna is always low? That's what's shown here. So if we now look across all the different societies, how well are different behaviors correlated with these environments? So temperate conifer forests for humans, mammals, and birds, there's a very strong positive correlation with food storage. So it's always high in temperate conifer forests. It's low for humans, mammals, and birds in tropical rainforests, and food storage is also low in the subtropical savanna. So what we can see here is that, yes, there are these ecological environments that predict the behavior, and they predict it in very similar ways for humans, mammals, and birds. And that's what's shown here. So it's very colorful. So you don't necessarily need to look at the specifics. It's more to show that if a given environment predicts the behavior, it predicts it in humans, mammals, and birds. So for meat diet, for example, there's a strong link with latitude, and it's strongly linked in humans, mammals, and birds. For social classes, there's also a link with latitude. For population density, there's a strong link with temperate conifer forests. And that's also then there for humans, mammals, and birds. So if a given ecological parameter explains variation in behavior, it usually does it in the same way across all the different species. So there really seems to be that link back to the local environment. And so we can also see that ecology explains variation in human behavior. So can we now look at these specific links and see whether they're also at play in humans? Does the link go through life history and kinship potentially to explain variation in social behavior? And so this is very preliminary, and so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because this is still, I'm starting to look into that, but there's some indication that similar links might happen. First, actually, kinship in human is not that different from kinship we observe in other species. So here's the average number of females in the group, average levels of relatedness among groups females. Each dot is a given population. Population of mammals with litters of offspring are up here in yellow. Populations of mammals with single offspring are the blue circles, and then human populations are the blue crosses. And humans fall right in the levels of relatedness that we observe in other mammalian species that also produce single offspring. So there's nothing specific about human group size and kinship within human groups. So it's not that we have specific different societies at least for these traditional foraging societies. And there might also be potentially a link with life history. So we did a paper a year ago where we looked at how kinship changes in human societies, where we had some preliminary observation. We only mentioned it in discussion. We haven't fully analyzed that seemed to indicate that also in human societies where we have these skewed pyramids where females have lots of offspring and most individuals die young, women seem to be more related to each other than in societies where women produce few offspring and then individuals live to a really late age. Then individuals seem to be unrelated to each other. So there might also be a link in humans from life history to kinship. But as I said, we need to look at this in more detail. And then we have some indication that then kinship also links to the variation in behavior in a very similar way as it does in other species. So this is what I showed you before across mammalian species, how average relatedness links to the reciprocity in grooming. This is a paper from Schultz and colleagues, where they looked at a kinship index in human nation states here, and again, reciprocal interactions, first off in public good games. We can see the same negative relationship that in human societies where this kinship index indicates that individuals are more closely related, then this reciprocal interactions are lower than when individuals are supposedly less closely related to each other. This is a very crude measure, so I think we need more detailed studies because it's a weird kinship index. It's based on nation states. So I think we need to go back and look within societies whether it's really the same link of individual interactions that are determined by who you interact with. And I guess these studies that I showed you before are really the great starting point for that, these social networks, because we know who individuals are, we know how they interact, and we know also their relatedness. So this study I showed you, the researchers actually knew who is related to whom. So that's shown here. This is the kinship structures. And actually, most individuals are unrelated to each other in these kinds of human groups, which is what we would expect, right? We have few offspring, large groups, so most individuals are unrelated to each other. And that also means that the majority of supportive partners are not close kin. So as I would predict, based on what we know from mammals, also what we then observe in this specific society is most interactions are not among kin. And what we can see is we have within caste support. So different colors actually indicate the caste of individuals in these societies. And then within the caste, what we find mainly is reciprocity. Again, what we would predict from what we know about how kinship influences interactions in other species. Wherever kinship is low, we just expect high levels of reciprocity. So I think we can take some of our understanding and use it to really then go into the details of how humans interact in their networks, how these networks forms, and what kind of types of social behavior they show. So I think that can be really interesting to now go in more detail and see to what kind of societies does it apply? Does it apply to more modern societies where individuals move more, where the boundaries of groups might not be that determined? And I think that's really going to be interesting because humans have this nested structure, where we don't just have the one group. You might be linked to your family, but you might also be linked to your colleagues at work. You might be part of a sports club. You might be part of a local village. So there's all these nested structures where you have potentially different interactions. And I think that's one big key message as well, that in humans, I think it's not that key that we have a specific behavior that characterizes that. I think what's key in humans is we have this flexibility and diversity in behavior, right? In social behavior and how we get food, we observe within our single species across these 338 societies. So I think that's really key in humans, I think, is this flexibility and diversity. And I think this is going to be really interesting now to see how much the flexibility and diversity can be shaped. And that's what I'm planning to look more in the futures. Can we really use this framework to understand more about the variation in human behavior? And with that, I'm happy now to take questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dieter. Let's see, we've got gallery view. Yep. Sorry, just that very last second there, we had a little bit of internet instability here, so I hope people could catch the very last minute. And it was just my connection and not everyone else's. So what we can do now for questions is if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will turn on your microphone. don't. Oh, yes, Hannah. Okay, I'll just turn on your mic, Hannah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yep. Cool. That was really nice, teacher. Very, very impressive. I would have several questions, but I'll just ask one. The positive correlation between what humans do and what all these other species do makes total sense when you approach it from your angle. But what if you were an ecologist who has been trained in like interspecific competition and niche differences and things like that? You would kind of like predict that in order to coexist, you have to do something different from all the others. So would you say that given that this is not the outcome you observe, that this is evidence that humans don't actually experience much competition from the other species? Instead, it's all just exploitation or whatever.
Right. So there are 2 points to that, right? The first point is that if we just even leave humans out, even just with other species, we could have this expectation that if one species occupies a given niche within a given environment, then it would just displace other species that might try to do something very similar. So I think what our results show is that it's somewhere in the middle, right? It's not that this is one extreme where you just displace everybody else who's doing something similar, or it's not the other extreme that's only one way to behave in a given environment. I think it comes back to this idea of constraints, where there's a limit of what you can do in that place. Like I said, when there are no fish, you can't go fishing. But then there might be different species that specify on different kinds of sizes of fish, or whether they get their fish from close to the shore or further in. I think we didn't look at these specific niches, where we had very crude definitions of, do you mainly get meat or not? We didn't say kind of what kind of hunting you do, where you get it. I think what you're describing with the competition in the niches might be more on this more fine-grained level. I think what we're just finding is that there's external constraint. You can't show the behavior if the resources aren't available. And I think then with thinking about it in humans, yes, there have been these arguments that humans might be so good at these things and then also use hunting to displace species that are very similar to themselves. But I think with these foraging societies, I think also to some extent with modern societies, there are still constraints. There's still a limit in what humans are able to do. And that is more similar potentially to some of the other species that live in the given environment. And that's also, I think, why we wanted to compare humans to all other species. There were some comments we had and some ideas we had where should we only compare humans to other terrestrial species that are also diurnal, because right, those should be the most similar. And maybe if we limit it more in that sense, we might find less of a similarity. But we looked at across all species, very small species, species that fly, species that live underground. I think that might also explain why we find some of the relationships, even if humans might displace some of the species.
Thanks, makes sense.
All right, I'll read out a question from a Q&A here. It's from Thanos. Forgive my pronunciation. How can high egalitarianism and frequent conflicts be sustained at the same time in the same populations? That was the question.
Right. So the frequent conflict we observe in these kinds of species is relatively low level. It really is about, I see an interesting piece of fruit and I might fight you over getting that. But that doesn't mean that I'm now excluded from my kind of resources, where there might be other fruit around. So it's actually quite low level of interactions. And that means that the actual winner can change quite rapidly. And that means that, yes, on a given day, one individual might be able to dominate somebody else. But then maybe a month later, if maybe another individual is now in a different condition, or you have been able to get a different coalition partner, that can be flipped. So there can still be dominance interactions within the group, and over a small time period, you can actually potentially rank individuals. But I think the one thing is that it can change very rapidly, and I think that's what we understand egalitarianism. And it might also mean that it's not perfectly linear, right? A might dominate B, and B might dominate C, but then C might, in some circumstances, be able to dominate A again. So that's also this idea with egalitarianism. Yes, you see in these interactions, there is a winner and a loser, but that might not be linked to this clear linear ranking of individual that's stable over time. And that's the stable over time. That's what we think with, if we think of there's a clear structure in the group and not egalitarian.
Okay. Anyone have a question? Please raise your hand and I will turn on your microphone. Caro.
Hi, Dieter from Seewiesen. Me, Caro. I have a question about the female investment and how that relates to the potential for association between them and between the groups. And how does seasonal reproduction factor into this? Because your work in that part, I think, relies very heavily on primate groups and whatnot. And I mean, species that have seasonal reproduction, you can, like for me, I would say you can switch between being social and asocial within the year, because you're just not investing anything into offspring for a big part of the year in lots of seasonal species. And what do you think, how seasonality, I mean, humans are an aseasonal species in lots of seasonal environments, and how that might interact with each other?
Right. Yes. So, right. There's two things about seasonality. The one thing about seasonality is whether, you have your reproduction seasonality time, and the other thing is how you use your environments across the seasons and how you actually shift that. And I think, yes, I mean, I would predict if reproduction is much more seasonal, during that time there's higher competition, and then females might be less likely to be close to each other. And I mean, we know that even for some of the group living species, that during the period when they give birth, females might separate themselves from the group to avoid their offspring being killed. I mean, we know that for species like chimpanzees, I think it's also true for hyenas, that right after females give birth, they're actually less likely to interact with other females and have their offspring for the first few days in separate burrows before they bring them back to the communal burrow. So I think you're right, especially round reproduction is when these things happen. And then you might have different kinds of social interactions at other times. And I think, especially for birds, you're absolutely right. If the reproductive season is over during the winter, you might have these flocks forming. You might have different societies being formed. So yes, I think it gets more complicated. I mean, I was alluding to that with the humans in the end. We have these different nested structures. And I think that's true also for other species, that we actually have to think about it, not just like, this is your group, but the definition of a group might change depending on where you put the boundaries. And then, as you correctly point out, as well across the seasons. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cara. Right, if anyone else has a question, if they'd like to raise their hand. Lukas, all right. Lukas, you should be able to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Hi there. Thanks, Dieter. That was a fantastic talk. Just thinking about your path diagram that you showed with the different arrows and the kind of possible causality underlying those relationships. The results in the second part of all the correlations, or the way that species within the same environment were correlated, doesn't that imply overall that the correlations in the associations in that overall path analysis could all be driven via the underlying ecological components, and that there's not necessarily any other separate independent links between the individual variables?
Yes, and that's a very good question. So we haven't looked at yet whether, so there's two parts. The one part is, we haven't looked at yet whether a given behavior is directly influenced by local ecological condition, or whether there's a pathway through something else. But there could be these things where, like, the behavior influences, for example, the ecology influences whether you can go hunting or not. And I think, for example, paternal care is much more likely in species where males can go hunting, because it's much more likely to actually contribute and bring something back to the offspring. So you might have these pathways that go through. We haven't looked at whether there are these kinds of packages of behavior, right? Whether different kinds of behavioral traits always go together and then they always occur in the same environment, or whether all these behaviors can vary independently of each other and then might be linked to specific ecological conditions or maybe specific other social pathways. So we haven't looked at that yet, and I think it would be really interesting to look at. The other thing, though, is that what we haven't also looked at is that, I think especially in humans, but I think there's also some evidence for other species, that the behavior now might have been selected in a given circumstance, but now because you have the behavior, you can move into a new environment. And that also changes our understanding about the causality. For example, I think with birds, there's the argument that cooperative breeding actually originated in relatively benign environments. But if you have helpers, it allows you to move into harsh environments. So we see these correlations that we're describing here between the location and the behavior. It doesn't necessarily always have to reflect the causal link about the origin of the behavior. It now might be a causal link about the maintenance of the behavior. but it might not necessarily be other. And I think it's also will be difficult because the arrows I showed are mainly focused on the origin, right? I mean, what initially led to the change in behavior that explains the differences among the species, whereas just the correlations might only just reflect the maintenance. So I think we need more work to really understand what drives these associations. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a large ecological influence on behavior, and now we need to understand it. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are really neat points.
Hannah, I think, wants to ask another question, so that's fine. Off you go, Hannah.
Yeah, if there's nobody else, then I'll just ask my second question, which is the you pointed out at some point that the arrows can actually, in most cases, go in both directions. And for much of your first half of your talk, you kind of like took litter size as the thing where the arrow starts, and then all kinds of other things follow. And I was thinking, what kind of things can impact litter size then? And of course, I mean, you mentioned body size and things like that, but whether your analysis could comment more on the kind of like more complicated. I was just thinking about one example when you said that if you have just a single offspring at a time, then the chances that they get killed are lower. And one potential causality for that could be that if you just have one, it's kind of easier to protect that one because you just pay attention to one at a time. And whether this could even explain some of the patterns and maybe even select for smaller litter sizes if you need to pay attention to them in order for them not to get killed. But that was really just sort of one example of how complicated it might get. So my question is actually simpler, like, have you thought about analyzing the arrow in that direction as a whole?
So yes, and so for the litter size, we actually did the phylogenetic reconstructions to see whether females were producing single offspring before groups started to develop. So with that phylogenetic reconstruction, where we can potentially have the sequence of change, that tells us a little bit more about the direction of the arrow. So that actually might be helpful. It's not always possible because some of the traits can change very quickly, so we might not be able to reconstruct the history. But I think for litter size and group living, we were able to show, there's first a change to single offspring in mammals, and then group living is much more likely to evolve. For something in the other directions, with monogamy and paternal care, we did find that once males start to show paternal care, which is only in mammals or primarily in mammals in monogamous species, females shorten their interbirth interval. And now, apparently, that's then the stage where offspring are reliant on receiving input from both mother and father. And then once you have paternal care, we never see monogamy being lost. Species might go extinct, but there's no reversion from monogamy to another social system. So that suggests that, you have now a sequence where males start to help, that change the life history, and potentially now, because the male has to help, they're stuck in that system. So I think that's an example where you have this kind of coevolution.
Thanks.
Any other questions there? If anyone would like to raise their hand. Otherwise, I realize we should let Dieter start to enjoy his day and get his cup of coffee or whatever it is he chooses to fuel himself with.
No, it's done.
All right. Maybe I'll end up with one as just a fun human one. So you mentioned the using the national data. Yeah, Cara, your microphone is still on.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Just so you don't say anything to embarrass yourself. You mentioned the relationship between the offer made in public good games and some level of kinship in societies. Mm-hmm. I just was wondering again, like many of these questions actually, when you've got lots of correlated factors, do you think another possibility there is not so much kinship, but simply the number of people you interact with? Because I can imagine for even within a given country, if you did small town versus urban, you would probably get a difference in the public good offering because of the number of interactions you have with the same people, which probably correlates with kinship as well. And I just thought there might be a fun test to do there.
Yep. So yes, I totally agree. And I think that's why we need to go back into these detailed studies that actually look at the direct interactions. I mean, this study, the kinship index they used was how long ago the Catholic Church banned cousin marriage. So I think it's also a very crude measure of kinship. I mean, potentially might explain something, but yes, I know. And then yes, they had the level of interactions with anonymous partners on the level of the state. So I think the levels of interaction might also be different if you actually know your partners and repeatedly interact with them. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think there could be these different levels of interactions where just whether you regularly interact with a small set of individuals might make you behave differently than if you're in this large anonymous group where you might not see the same individual again, where you need institutions to govern your behavior.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm in a department where lots of people study culture. And I think that's another big point that comes in there. To what extent then is a cultural norm just a solidification of a behavior you would do anyway because it's the best in that environment? Or to what extent is your behavior really a reflection of the norm that is being forced upon you by other individuals? And I think that's also another factor that we need to consider in humans, whether potentially your behavior might reflect past changes that are now solidified in social norms that aren't necessarily the best anymore in the environment where you're now in.
I feel we need a seminar on causality. I feel that underpins a lot of what we've been discussing of late. Yeah. I think we should end there because I know people have to get off and feed their children, many of them, because it's after 5 here. So look, thank you so much for giving this talk today. I thought it was fantastic. I'm really glad we have it recorded because I think it's going to be a great resource for people teaching. I think there's so many nice questions that your work has raised, and it'll keep people happy for hours having journal clubs and discussions. So it lasts much longer than simply the hour or so that you've given us today. So thank you so much, Dieter, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you to everyone else who's come along, and I hope you have great days too. All right. Thank you very much.